Today we're going to be talking about page formatting, page writing, the literal words on the page. And it's a tricky subject because it's a balance, 50% and 50%, meaning half of it is, here are the rules, here's what you're supposed to do, here's what everybody's supposed to do. The other half of it is, you can kind of do whatever you want. There are a lot of caveats to that, though. Most of the caveats involve the writers who do whatever they want have proven that they know how to master the basics and the formula, and that they've proven they can write an amazing script, or they're produced, or they're A-list screenwriters. It's much, much different when you read a Quentin Tarantino screenplay, because he's going to just literally do whatever he wants, because A, he's him, but also he's going to direct it. And so it doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously, trying to sell a 245-page script to a studio or something is nearly impossible. It is impossible for an unknown writer. But for a Quentin Tarantino, it's just a completely different world. So we kind of have to look, because I'm assuming most of us here have not produced a major movie or sold a bunch of scripts, or you haven't quite proven yourself in the industry. We're going to go from that angle. Here is what, relatively speaking, what we're supposed to be doing from a formatting, page writing level. Okay, so I think the first thing that we want to talk about, well, I'll introduce myself just a little bit for anybody who doesn't know who I am. I'm the Director of Education with the ISA. I obviously run these events and classes. I wrote the coursework for ISA called The Craft Course, which, by the way, we're offering 50% off right now. So for $49, you get a 12-week course that you can use for the rest of your life, as often as you want. It's all written and audio lectures, as well as some video on there. I'm going to be adding things to it. We're going to be updating it just to give it a fresh look, get some new assignments and stuff in there pretty soon. You're going to see a little bit of that, because I'll share my screen to show some of the coursework. You go to thecraftcourse.com, pretty basic, and you apply this code when you purchase it. But yeah, August CC50. So I wrote the coursework for that. I've been with the ISA for a little over 6 years. I run alongside Felicity Wren, the development company that we have, a production company, but it's primarily a development company. The difference mainly is that we aren't going to be on set actively producing. We're developing company projects with writers. We have a slate of scripts that we're going out with, playing the pitching game. We're rep by an agency, all that stuff. So I do that on a daily basis, but I'm also a consultant. I work and have my own company called The Story Farm. Some of you may have heard of that. You can go to thestoryfarm.org. I have a lot of clients right now, and I'm going to be cutting off my roster as of September 15th. So if you did want to work with me, you can email me, max@thestoryfarm.org. I have a whole bunch of different options in terms of call packages and all that stuff. Basically, I've been doing this kind of thing in terms of working in the screenwriting education world and just the Hollywood industry in general for a little over 16 years, from various assistant positions in I don't know how many different areas of the industry, from advertising to film distribution to everything. I've been with, like I said, with the ISA for 6 years, and it's been a lot of fun. I love doing these monthly webinars, and we could keep doing these for as long as we can. Today's webinar is a little bit of a repeat. I think it's been maybe 4 or 5, it could even be longer, 6 or 7 months since we had a webinar about page writing. So I'll be repeating a little bit for those of you who may have been on that one. I'm going to focus more on the words on the page, like scene writing, scene headings, the specific technical stuff, not necessarily how, I'll probably cover a little bit of it, and obviously you can ask questions about it, but how to write a great scene. That's really kind of a whole other webinar, which I may end up starting just a separate podcast on that, because it's so relative to the genre, to who you are and your voice, to who the characters are, what they want in terms of their flaws and their personalities, but also structurally speaking. Not every scene is created equally. Some scenes may be 6 pages long, some may be 1 or less, and it's all visuals. So it really all depends. So that's much more of a kind of broad scope, esoteric approach, from an emotional structure level for scene writing. This is specifically called page writing. So what I want to dive into is a little something that I had a conversation with one of my writers the other day, and we're in the process where he's now getting into the page writing of the project we've been developing for the past, 8 or 9 weeks. And that 8 weeks, we'll say, was focused on the top 2 levels of development. And there are 4 levels of development, and they're the same as the 4 levels of what a reader is consciously or unconsciously thinking when they're reading. So those 4 levels at the top is concept, character development, structure, and then the actual page work. My hands are disappearing. So concept, character, structure, page work. The reason it's broken up that way, and if you think of it as kind of like a, like an upside down V, concept is the smallest little portion at the top, and then we get a little bit bigger with character development, a little bit bigger with structure, a little bit bigger with page work. And what I mean by bigger is the amount of time we spend considering it when reading, but also the amount of time we spend working on it as the writer, right? The development process. Really, it should be flipped. You know, we should be spending that much less time on the page writing and that much more time on the other levels. So it's just the way for my brain to organize it, but it's also for you all to just consider what is going through a reader's brain when they're reading, because it's almost like a line of defense, right? The tricky part is that a reader, it's impossible for a reader to not notice the words on the page because that's how it's being delivered. If they see the words, that's how, you know, everything else is based on the words, which is, I can't come up with a more basic way of saying that. What I mean specifically is that they're of course considering concept, but they've probably already considered that through the log line or some form of a pitch that they've received. And then they're getting to a point now where it's like, all right, I get what the hook is, concept, what the themes might be, message, etc. Now I'm going to focus on these characters and see how they're delivering this. And then unconsciously they're thinking, when are these things happening? You know, do we get to this primary, I call it a setup event or series of setup events. A lot of people call it the inciting incident. If we're waiting 45 to 50 pages to get to that big setup, yeah, obviously they're thinking structure when yeah, it's too late. Or maybe it's too soon or too early. But you know, that's more of an unconscious thing, but they're focusing on the characters, and then of course through by which we're seeing the characters or the words on the page. All of this is jumbled together in a mess for the reader, but it's just naturally going that way in terms of how they're reading this. The whole point of this is that if the concept isn't really hitting its mark, or they're not interested in the concept, all the other levels don't matter because they're not going to read it. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't like you as the writer, it's just the concept isn't for them. If they read it because they think the concept is for them, and then the characters aren't really jiving, or they're not, you know, as emotional as they'd like, or I'm not connecting to the characters, structure doesn't matter. If they love the characters, but then they're seeing there's some things kind of off with the structure, well, we can fix that, but it might be way off, and I don't know how much time I have as the reader to really spend it, you know, trying to fix it. If structure's working pretty well, then they're just pretty much focusing on the words on the page. Here's the rub. If your words on the page, like you could have amazing concept, characters are incredible, and the structure is just, you know, perfect in terms of the basic idea of formula, even though, and that's a whole other argument, we don't necessarily need to go by way of formula. But if all those things are working, but the words on the page just aren't delivering what it, like technically speaking, and I mean literally in a technical sense, what they're supposed to be doing. Like if you have a crazy amount of parentheticals, or you've got paragraph descriptions that are like half the page or more, or you know, there's a ton of typos, or you're screwing up scene headings, and then all the other stuff is thrown out the window because these people who are reading don't have the time to deal with that. And then that's just the truth, because that's the easiest part, to just understand that it's your job as the writer to use these words properly so that it's easy for the other 3 levels to be consumed. So that's why, you know, I have to have an entire webinar, and really I could do more than an hour on all of this, to really break down, here's what we generally speaking should be doing, especially as new writers or writers who haven't quite, you know, broken in yet. Because it's the easiest thing to screw up, but it's also like the first thing somebody's going to notice when they're reading, oh, this writer doesn't really understand the process or formatting of a script. And it's the easiest thing to fix. So that's why we're talking about this. It kind of comes from this level of the 4 levels of development. Now moving into this idea of a first draft, and going back to how I initially was talking about having one of my sessions with one of my story farm writers. He's getting into the page writing portion of this. We spent a long time working through the outline, figuring out concept, who are these characters, what are their issues, problems, personalities, flaws, wants versus desire and need, and all that stuff. So we had all that stuff down. Here we go. Let's put it into structure. And then we spent a long time in the outline. Let's figure out where these things are going to happen and how. What are the moments? What are the scenes? And then you can start moving those moments and scenes around. Now we're at a place where he's writing pages. He sent the first 29 pages last week. And I still fully believe in the concept. Characters are cool. Structure was like, yeah, okay, fine. We're pretty much there. That's pretty easy to move some things around. The page writing, though, was a mess. And he's been working for a long time as a writer. You know, he hasn't had any major things produced or anything, but he's been doing this a long time. And I wanted to point out to him that this process of the writing process is still just as essential as all of the time that we spent on the outlining and the brainstorming, et cetera, in terms of treating this like it's your final draft. Otherwise, why are you doing this? And so that brought up this idea of this term called vomit draft. And you've all heard it. It's just your first draft. It's just a rough draft. On a whole bunch of levels, I totally get that mindset. But at the same time, I don't agree with just a vomit draft, because if you haven't done the work in terms of the outlining, the character work, all the structural beats and figuring all that out, then your vomit draft is going to be literally a vomit of something that you haven't quite figured out, and it's actually wasting your time. And there's this little thing that happens in a writer's brain, and I'm a writer, I've been doing it for a long time, and I know how everybody thinks. Generally speaking, we want to show that draft to people, even if we know, it's just a rough draft, but I want you to read it, because I want to see what you think. Worst decision you could make, especially if you're just kind of throwing words down on a page and you don't really know what's happening, but also you haven't focused on making the scene direction pop, making sure these scene direction or scene headings are working, and then you got all these grammar issues and typos, blah, blah, blah. The person is going to be thinking this script's terrible, when really it might actually have a ton of potential. So point being, your vomit draft, your rough draft, your first draft, that's all in the outlining process. Once you get into the pages, now let's take this seriously. Let's treat it like I'm writing my final draft version. The rewriting can happen if scenes aren't working or structure's a little off, or I want to make some different character decisions. But you shouldn't have to go back through and edit things. Like, editing is not rewriting. It's a completely different thing. Editing is just changing words and letters around, and oops, I've got some grammar issues, or yeah, this parenthetical doesn't make, that's not rewriting. So we want to get beyond this idea of, I'm just going to sit down and write a draft and just see how it works. Because you're really not doing yourself that many favors. It does help from a creative energy level. It can be inspirational if you finish a draft and all that. I mean, I'm not trying to say there are no good reasons to do just a basic vomit draft, but you can save yourself some time. And like I was saying, we want to make sure that we're treating this seriously, writing these words with intention, with purpose, because, and this is what I said to my writer, no word in a screenplay, and I mean this literally, is a throwaway. There's no room for, I guess that'll work. You know, I mean, maybe the first time you write it, you're like, oh, I don't like that line, but I'm going to keep going because I'm in the flow. I'm going to go back and try to make that a little stronger. That's fine. But you still want to make it sound as best as you can, right? I mean, it's, again, you're just going to end up wasting your time. So you want to be taking this seriously. I had a little bit of a train of thought that broke there. It's so hot in Wisconsin that my brain is not working very well. I just don't want to get off track. So, right. Oh yeah, and then I had this cheesy little cliche that I said to my writer in this idea of writing your rough draft, you know, the so-called final draft, is that let's not worry so much about page count, but let's focus more on making your page count. You know, whatever, it's easy to remember that. You want to make the page count, not, oh, I'm at page 29, and because that's just going to slow you down. If you have a 125-page script, all right, fine. The best way to remove pages, meaning if you have too long of a script, is to gets rid of scenes, not, oh, I can make indentations here, or I can get rid of one line of scene direction and that'll save me a little. That's not rewriting. You really want to dig in and go, okay, I've got 125 pages, but at least I know the words on the page read well. It's just too long. And now the rewriting actually happens where you're making big decisions. This scene with this character and these multiple characters with these intentions doesn't make sense. I don't need it, or I need to shorten this to a point of it's just a moment, or can I say this or show this scene through only visual instead of using dialogue? That's rewriting. So anyway, don't worry about page count. Just make sure your page counts, and that's where focusing on these words on the page really does come into play. Let me just see what questions popped up, because it may be okay. Standard for writing text messages. Yeah, these are good questions. Page count, including act breaks, cold opens, tags for sitcoms. Does it need to change according to where you're trying to pitch? Good question. I'm going to get to all these. I just want to see where we are. Any tips for outlining? I'm horrible. Yeah, all kinds of problems. And you say it's a good strategy to focus only on writing out your story in the first draft and everything else for later drafts. So pretty much that it's kind of like a yes answer. I'll get to all these in specifics, but I'm going to kind of cover some of this stuff. I want to get into because the last, well, sorry, my brain's kind of overloading. The last time we had a webinar on page writing, I kind of went off a little bit and focused on a little more of how to deliver a solid scene, what makes for great dialogue. It's not like I shouldn't or don't want to be covering that today. I didn't talk enough about formatting and the what do you do with scene headings and all that stuff. So I want to do a little bit more of that. I'll get to those questions in a second. They're really good questions. So let's first just get into the nitty gritty here. I might show you a screen share of the coursework, but yeah, I'll just get into specifics here. So scene headings. I know that seems so ridiculous because it's like, well, whatever, you throw a scene heading down. It does matter, obviously, because like I said, no word on the page is a waste. Everything has to matter, everything counts. The thing to remember about scene heading is that it's twofold, meaning the reason they exist. First reason in our minds, because we're writers, is for the reader's experience. So for one, they should all look the same. If you're going to go int.library-day, it should always look that way, right? You're not going to then later go int.library.day. Don't change it up. Just keep that format the same. It's noticeable when a reader's going through it. They're like, oh, I think they did that differently last time. And the last thing you want is for your words on the page to slow the read or make a reader hitch or pause a second to think about something else, especially grammar and formatting, because it's so basic, right? So you want the scene headings to match in terms of the pattern. They're going to look the same. Sometimes when you have, let's say, Max's house, it's going to be int Max's house, -day. That isn't really specific enough. If you think about it, you're just referencing Max's house. But what does that mean? Where are you in the house? Max's house, then -bathroom, -day. Max's house, -dining room, -day. You're going to start from bird's eye view, then work your way in, and then hit day. Meaning you're going to start with the overall location of Max's house, and then you're going to get into the specific room. If you do it the other way around, meaning int dining room -Max's day Max's house -day, fine. That's not the normal way of doing it. It's preferred to do it the other way, where your primary location, then the specific location within that location. Nonetheless, point being, if you do it the other way around, you have to keep it that way throughout the whole script. You have to follow the pattern. Because the reader will get used to it, and they're like, oh, okay, that's how they're doing it. It might sort of irk them or not. Some people may not even notice, as long as you're doing it the same way. And then we'll talk about day and night, or morning, or evening, or later, or continuous. These are all things that I see come up constantly, not only in all the scripts that I read, but in a lot of the writers I work with. how do you do this, or they're using it incorrectly. For one, my suggestion, you don't have to do this, I'm not saying that this is hard and fast rule. My suggestion is to just use day or night, regardless of when it actually is in day or night. Because the other facet or reason for using a scene heading is for a very literal technical reason, and that is for the crew and the production people who are reading the script and breaking down the actual shoot if the thing is being shot. There are physical reasons for that scene heading, and those scene headings have to, if we come back to Max's dining room, and let's say there are 4 scenes that occur there, the crew needs to break out who's going to be working in that location, what's the lighting setup, what are the angles that the director is going to tell you, how many people do we need there, how many actors are in that moment, and they start scheduling things out, because they'll shoot, probably anyway, all of the dining room scenes, because they're there, right? So they'll group all 4, and they'll shoot all of them there. And the actors, you don't have to switch days, right? You don't necessarily shoot a script from scene 1 to the end, right? That'd be kind of ridiculous. If you have one location and 5 scenes that have happened there, shoot all 5 scenes there. So nonetheless, that's the specific reason for the use of the scene heading. That's where they came from. The reason it isn't always necessary to do something like evening or morning, sunset, sunrise, or whatever, is because that doesn't really matter to the crew. Day or night, what's the light? And the director's going to determine, this is the feeling, this is the tone. Even if it's daytime, I still kind of want it to be a little dark and gray. It gives you a sense of time, of course. Is it at night or is it during the day? But the only real reason to use or reference the time is if the story depends on it. Like the show 24, they didn't even bother with a day or night. It was the literal time, because the whole thing is an hour long in real life, in real time. Then that makes sense, because it's a time-based story. If you have something where the whole story takes place during one day, then yeah, you can say this is sunrise, this is dawn, late morning, because now it has something specific to do with the story. And the crew will still be able to deal with, okay, well, it's daytime because they're saying late morning. But that's when, now moving into scene descriptions, that there's a direct connection, because the reason I tend to suggest, I'm trying to be easy with that because I don't want to force you to do something you don't want to do. If you have a specific reason for saying evening instead of night, then I hope you have the right specific reason. Nonetheless, with connection to the scene direction, scene descriptions, by the way, they're called many things, action lines, scene description, scene direction. If it just says day, it's your job as the writer then to paint what the day looks like, right? Give us a little bit of a visual feel. You don't always have to do that in every single scene. But if, let's say, it's later in the day, you can just say, Max's dining room day, and then there's a little bit of a reference of the sun's low in the sky, so the sun's rays shoot through the window and cast long shadows across the floor. I mean, that's probably longer than you even need, but it's that idea. You can still play with time if you're still just using day or night. And again, one of the reasons that I like and suggest day or night is because most of the time the reader doesn't want to think about the scene heading. They want to glance at it, there it is, okay, here we are, and then in the scene direction, still get a sense of the location and time, visuals, tone. So Christy is asking, if we order a development evaluation from the ISA, will that include comments on the page writing format? Yes. There are 5 different sections of the development evaluation where it's overall, and then they talk about concept, character development, structure, and the page writing. And they make suggestions along the way. Yeah, I mean, not major brainstorms, but every now and then, if the writer or the reader who is then writing the evaluation has suggestions, or maybe you could do this instead. But you get that every now and then. But yes, the page writing format it's in a lot of ways equally as important as concept, character, or structure. So that's scene direction. And then that's now moving into the scene description and scene direction. I said that, didn't I? That's scene heading in connection with scene direction. See, it's hot. My brain is melting. Kelly has a question about montage format, rules, and when to be great. So, and that all fits within this idea of scene direction, action lines. This in and of itself could probably be an hour. So I'll use a little disclaimer. A lot depends on the genre of your project that then dictates how you're going to be writing the action. At the same time, you can, it's tricky to put it into disclaimer, but it has to be done because everybody's script's different, everybody's voice is different, everybody's approach and technique is different. If you look at a Shane Black compared to a Craig Zahler, you know, Shane Black did Lethal Weapon, Craig Zahler did that crazy Western horror movie that, I can't remember what it's called. Zahler is a very famous screenwriter in town, and he's had a couple movies made. Brilliant screenwriter. But if you look at the difference between the two, Shane Black, very fast-paced, down-the-page writing, extremely particular with word choice. His tone is very specific to his own voice and who he is, a little sarcastic, and that's probably even by saying that, a little sarcastic. He's very sarcastic. So there's a level of comedy and bravado and cockiness, and you know, it's all part of him, so it's coming out through the action. And by writing down the page, because it's an action movie, most of those thrillers that he's writing have action sequences literally on screen. You're going to see them be chasing somebody or being chasers, or car chase, or, you know, everything's bam, bam, bam. You know, kiss, kiss, bang, bang with Robert Downey Jr. and Michelle. Oh boy, I remember the last name. She's wonderful. But is it Michelle? Anyway, really fun movie, by the way. You should see it. But oh, Christy's asking, no place for old men. I'm not sure what that means, Christine. This is why I probably shouldn't focus on the comments, just because I don't want to lose my train of thought. But thank you for asking the question. So he's writing down the page because that speed of the read is going to then be dictated on screen, right? It's a fast-paced movie. If you have that type of story and you want it to be fast-paced, then you want to write it that way because that's how the audience member is going to feel, and so that's how you want the reader to feel. Shorter scene descriptions, action lines, it's bam, bam, bam down the page. Craig Zahler has this horror Western, really gruesome, but there's a ton of suspense. There's this constant uneasy feeling throughout the whole movie, for obvious reasons, because it's a horror movie. But it isn't like a slasher type of Friday the 13th movie. That's much more of an action-based horror movie. Zahler's script is actually, in weird ways, slow to read, and yet it's still incredibly engaging, so it reads quickly because he's just a really good writer and he has a way with words. But he has these big chunk paragraphs and a lot of descriptions, and it almost reads like a novel, and yet it's still keeping it extremely visual. That gives a much different feeling of the read itself when you're aligning the scene descriptions in that way, because you as the reader are completely immersed in just this one paragraph. So you're not then thinking, oh, this is taking me a while to read through it because it's so visually compelling. And there's this feeling of just unease throughout. And that's how the movie plays out. Until it doesn't, until there are some very fast action moments and slashes, and it's almost like you're writing these scene directions, and I shouldn't say almost like, you are basically writing these action lines and scene descriptions as cuts. Like here, you have one line of action, and then we're going to cut to this, and then cut to that. It's kind of like you're telling the editor, without telling the editor, how to edit the scene. And that's the tricky part, because the editor and director, they're going to take that scene and go, well, here's what we want to do with it. And that's the whole point. They should. Writing a screenplay is an invitation to collaborate with somebody. Be willing to accept that. But nonetheless, that's kind of how you're going to be writing any scene. It's like edit to edit to edit. And if you think of it that way, you stay in that visual mode and visual sense. In terms of montages, there's almost, well, I always say almost, but there is a direct correlation to those edits, right? Because if you have a montage reference, you're going to be showing this is part of this, and then you see that, and then you have another, line or two, and we have this, and then you have another one, and maybe you put hyphens, to start each action line, so that it just kind of feels more like a list, because a montage feels like a list. We see this thing happen, and then this thing happen, and then there's music or whatever, and maybe you have one line of dialogue every now and then. So it's a direct reference and correlation to the edit of the moments and multiple moments. In terms of how to arrange it, Kelly, so it's really kind of up to the writer. There's no, hard and fast rule as to here's exactly what you need to do for a montage. It is important, usually, to put in caps, begin montage, because then it tells the reader, oh, okay, so that's how, I'm not going to just go from visual to visual. It's going to have a different feel to it. It's like I said, music. You're going to have some kind of transition between each. You don't have to write a transition because it's montaged, etc. Director, editor will figure that out. And then finish it with end montage. I always suggest trying to keep the descriptions of the visuals within the montage relatively short. And I think 3 lines down in an action paragraph is a good general rule of thumb to keep throughout the whole script. If you're a new writer and you haven't had anything produced yet, getting away with 4 lines down is usually totally fine, as long as it reads well and it isn't just cumbersome and it's like one long run-on sentence or something. But and we'll get to the grammar portion of this in a second. But hopefully that helps, Kelly. It's just approach it like it's a list. If you have, let's say, even if you do little circles, let's say there are circles beginning every action line. Fine, but that you have to do that every time then for the montage. If you have multiple montages throughout the script, I hope you don't have more than 3 because it turns into a completely different project. But then you have to do it the same way, because then at least the reader knows what to expect. There's something, they're ready to, okay, here's another montage, and they don't have to think about the formatting of it on the page, they're just in. So think of it as a list. Over 4 lines, then list actions. Let me see if I can show an example. This is a good example of writing down the page. His longest set of action lines, this is what I mean by 2 lines down right here. The bus shuffles on. 2 lines down, 2 lines down, 2 lines down. And all these are single. This is a high suspense, relatively thrilling scene. And he's capitalizing words. And when you capitalize a word, from a production standpoint, literal production reasons, that's telling the crew this is a sound we are going to create. But it's also telling the reader this is a sound that I'm hearing and it's important. Not only because in some references like a mystery, suspense, ghost story or something, maybe the sound is important to the story. Nonetheless, I'm going to capitalize it because we hear it. In this case, clangs is just part of the feeling, right? There's part of the emotion of the read. This writer doesn't do it a ton, which I think is good. But he does do it when, he wants something to stand out. So this is what I mean by lines down. We'll just scroll through. He's got 3 lines down. And it's the start of a scene itself. He actually has evening with him. Not incredibly important in terms of the story, but nonetheless, you can do it if you want. It's just, make sure that you're nailing the rest of the words. So anyway, 3 lines down, 2 lines down, 1 line down. That's what I mean by lines down. And if you look through the whole thing, he doesn't do it very often. 3, 3, 3 again. You just want to keep it clean. I don't know if you've heard this, it's not showing, the term of white on the page or black on the page. If you have a lot of black on the page, that means you're having like big chunks of paragraphs of action or long, monologues from the characters. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. It's just after a while, it's a lot for the reader to read. It slows the read down a lot. So if you do want to do that, if you do want to slow the reader down for a very specific story reason, fine, do it. But nonetheless, it can become cumbersome. Let's see. Kelly, I have a question. Even though I said I'm not going to look at comments here, I'm looking at comments. I have questions about montage format, we kind of talked about that. Also how to label it if animation or CG. You can just say it in some way. You maybe put it in italics or something. You know, montage occurs in an animated style of, just so we get a sense of what the style is, if it's anime or you know, stick figures or comic book, you know, Roy Lichtenstein or whatever, you know. You can just say it outright, but keep it really short and specific. Let's see, I think I touched on that, Kelly. 4 lines. Pre-lap, totally fine, Jim. I see it sometimes. So, yeah, Marilyn, that's right. Technically, each new line down, you know, like the section, is a new shot. Yeah, ask for screenwriting. Yeah, and not every single time, most of the time. But that is kind of what you're telling the reader. It's kind of what you're telling the crew. That's the whole basis of the screenplay. It's like this, you know, template for a shoot, and breaking up the action into multiple lines is, yeah, it's like we're gonna have that edit, we're gonna have this edit, we're gonna have this shot, we're gonna have that shot. Not every single time is that exact or perfect, but you as the writer, it's your job and responsibility to allow the reader to get that feeling that this is a good example of how it's probably gonna look on screen. It's probably gonna change, but otherwise. Jim, pre-lap. Yeah, so what everybody knows in terms of pre-lap, it's kind of like you're seeing a visual, but then you've got somebody's line of dialogue that's happening over the visual from the previous scene, and then we come into a new scene heading, new action lines, etc., and then the character continues with the dialogue that was referenced in the previous scene. So like you see it in TV a lot, you see it in movies too, but you know, you finish off with like a car driving down this long farm driveway, and you've got a voiceover of somebody saying, you know, I never knew or figured that anybody would find out, making this up. And then we cut to investigation, you know, room at a police department. Again, this is top of my head. And then we see the character sitting down on the table, and he or she continues on, you know, with the rest of that line of dialogue. So it's totally fine to say pre-lap. It isn't absolutely necessary because if it just says voiceover or VO next to the character's name, and then we have the dialogue and we move to the next scene, and then the same character, now we see that person sitting at this table, and then they continue the previous thought, it's fine. Pre-lap is a very technical term, a little bit more production-oriented kind of term. I would try to steer clear as much as you can from those production technical-oriented references in the script. We see this, angle on. I'm not sure what L-cut in editing means, Jim, which means I don't see that reference in screenplays very often. So I'll get to your question in a second, Kelly. Sorry, everybody who put questions in the Q&A. I promise I'll get to those. We're already coming up into 45 minutes, so we'll probably go longer than an hour here because there are other things to cover. But this is kind of all-encompassing in terms of the page writing stuff. So where was I? I'm forgetting. This is what happens. So video comes, oh, so yeah, the technical stuff. Video comes in before audio's done. Yeah, I mean, let's change those words around a little bit, Jim. Instead of video, it's visuals. And I know it sounds like semantics, but from a writer standpoint, we're not concerned with the video. We're not concerned with the actual technical construct of I'm writing shot. It's, I need to deliver the feeling through the visual in a literary way without being novelistic, which I know it sounds confusing, but it's our job as writers to be the writer, not the director. This is not our job to be the cinematographer. It's not our job to even be the actor. I mean, we have to be the character. I know you, again, I'm getting into semantics here, but it's a strong distinction from a level of how I approach the page. Because again, we don't need angle on. It's not our job to say, director, you're going to make sure this camera is pointed that way. It's not our job to do that. Our job is to set up the feeling of the scene so the director can utilize that feeling and put his or her own take on it. So as an example, I think I had it in my coursework, but let me see if I can bring this up. But you know, if there is a banana sitting on a bed, shoot, you know, I had this written out somewhere. I'll share my screen in a second. I'm just reading this. but you know, if there's a banana sitting on a bed, and we, you know, say angle on bed, or angle on banana at edge of bed, why not just say at the edge of the bed sits a, you know, withering old banana? That feels more interesting from a literal feeling standpoint. And then we're not worried about how the director's going to actually shoot that banana. It's more about the feeling of the banana. It's a horrible example, but there's a distinction there, you know, so we want to stay away from the technical elements there. Every now and then, using a we see is the easier way of, you know, getting this, you know, visual presented. I get that, because we're not saying it's a 90-degree angle on this thing, or perpendicular to the thing is the camera angled on the window. We see every now and then is fine, but it's too easy to use that all the time, because technically speaking, the whole script is we see. The whole thing is what we're seeing. So we don't really need to say that very often. Again, if it's needed, then yeah, it's nobody's going to say, oh, you use we see, I'm going to stop reading. You know, overuse maybe. Okay, so let me see. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody here. Correct way to use intercuts. Let me get to some of these Q&A questions first. Let me see here. So, standard for writing, this is Carlo asking, what's the standard for writing text messages? Really good question, because there isn't really a standard. What you want to be thinking is, okay, what's the visual? Is the character looking at a cell phone? Is the character looking at their laptop screen? You want to be specific to the visual. You know, if the phone vibrates, maybe vibrates is capitalized. Jake looks down, and then you can say on-screen text messages, and you can capitalize that maybe with a colon. And then write it in italics. You know, you can maybe even list it. Whatever you want to, really in a way, whatever you want to do. You can have one line, it's all italics, and you're not even selecting dialogue or character or anything. You're just still selecting action in your Final Draft software. It's just, here's this in italics, and then you have another line down. Here's this. As long as it isn't too long and taking up the entire page. You can be stylistic with it a little bit, but if you use that style, let's say 3 times, we're looking at references of text messages throughout the whole script, it's got to be the same way. Otherwise, then it's just going to be like, well, what am I looking? No hard and fast rule there. As long as it makes sense, as long as the reader doesn't have to think about it, and you can just spell it out on screen text messages. Oh, okay, and then you're just going to read it. Like nobody's really all that concerned about how it's being arranged on the page, as long as it's easy to understand and see. Stephen, as far as page count, including act breaks and cold opens, okay, it's tags for sitcoms, and thank you for reminding me. Does it need to change according to where you're trying to pitch? To Netflix, streaming, cable, or broadcast? So absolutely yes. In terms of page count, TV is a much more strict number in terms of page counts. Features are a little bit more open-ended, but as new writers who have yet to, you know, make a break in the industry, they haven't yet sold something, they're still trying to get noticed. I would say anything over 115 pages, 115, it's too many. It's just too many. Most readers in either companies or managers or agents or anybody, one of the first things, if not the first thing they're going to look at when they're reading a script from a writer they don't know, or they've been referred to, or you might have won a contest or something. They're going to look at the page count, and if they see 170 pages, they're going to be like, "Oh God, I don't even care what the story is." I do it all the time. I'll be completely honest with you. If I see a script that's 107 or 8 or 9, I'm like, "Okay, it's clean." Which sounds ridiculous. It's like 9 more pages, but it does something to the brain of the reader, and you don't want to do that. You want to keep it clean. So a feature, you know, if you're under 100 pages, great. If you're up to 110, 12, 13, 15, you know, gets a little iffy there once you're 114, 115. But that's a pretty wide range of page count. The biggest caveat there is it really depends on genre. If you're writing a romantic comedy, I would say if you're over 105, probably too long. You want to keep it down to 100 pages. Horror movies, it depends, you know, how much dialogue is in it versus how little dialogue. If you don't have a lot of dialogue, dialogue tends to take up a lot of page space. You still probably want to be around the 100 page count. Somebody's asking about action comedy. And you can get away with 110, 111, because you're going to have a lot of down-the-page writing, right? You're going to be boom, 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 boom. You probably some car chases, somebody running after somebody, and it's going to be much more fast-paced. That takes up page. So anyway, in the general feature length, page length arena is much more broad. For TV, really good question, Steve, in that network shows are much more strict when it comes to page count. For a traditional sitcom like a Big Bang Theory, Mom, you're looking at anywhere between 22 to maybe 26 pages. You're probably not going to go much longer than that. It depends, again, on the episode, but very specific. And 22 might be a little too small. It's 23, 26. Very little wiggle room. And that goes for most network shows. You might see some at 27, 28, but again, it all depends on the show. A lot of fast dialogue or something, that's going to extend a little bit. But nonetheless, it's going to definitely be under 30 pages. Half-hour comedies on Netflix, streamers, cable, you can get away with 32, 33, 34. I've seen 34. 35, 36 really depends on the writer. Again, depends on the show. But you can get away with more than 30 pages, but not many more. It's much more strict. Hour long, kind of the same deal. Network shows are much more specific. You have to account for the commercial breaks. The episode itself would be 45, 47 minutes long. So you're going to be definitely under 60 pages, absolutely under 60, 57, 58 pages. Again, it's a little loosey, but not as loose as the features. You're going from either 95 pages or 115. For hour-longs on an HBO or a streamer or Amazon Prime or something, you can get away with 64, 65 maximum. I've seen some that are longer, but it's extremely rare. For writers who have not yet proven themselves, you want to keep it as close to 60 as you can, but you can get away with 61, 62. So it matters. Networks are going to usually be a little bit shorter. Streamers, you can get away with a little bit longer. It's much more specific to, that old adage of every script page is roughly a minute of screen time. That's very loose in and of itself. And some pages could be 20 seconds because it's all this fast dialogue, but nonetheless, averaging out. I'm going to try to stick to that idea. Let's see. Any tips for outlining and portable edit, which causes all kinds of problems? Really big question, Kelly. It's a good one because at the very beginning of this, I said that we want to be focusing our outline process like our first draft and second draft, so that by the time you're getting into the pages, your actual script feels more like a second or third draft. What that means is that you're spending a lot of time on the outline. But how to approach an outline, every consultant, teacher has a different way and different approach. I don't think any of them are more right than the others. I think they're all very helpful. So that's my little disclaimer. I take the approach for a feature that you have 12 sequences, 3 sequences in the first act, 6 sequences in the second, 3 sequences in the third. Each sequence is roughly 6 to 8, maybe 10 pages long, except for sequences 10 and 11, they're quite a bit shorter. Nonetheless, you have 12 sequences, and in each sequence, something, a particular element to the story is supposed to be happening. It's not necessarily template or formula, but it is a very logistical structural approach. You have main character stage of life, the setup event, secondary character, introduction to how they're affecting the main character. That makes up your first act. I could go into this. There is a video on the Pro Tips and Tricks page. Everybody, you should watch this if you're interested in logistical structure. I talk about the emotional structure also, which is different. Not a lot, but it's a little different. But there's a video on there. I think it's just something about structure. I can't remember what the title is, but you can just find the one that's referencing structure. So, because I talk about outlining a lot there. Basic piece of advice when outlining: stay organized from a structural standpoint, so that you're brainstorming from a level of here's generally what I think is going to happen when. And that goes for a traditional network sitcom or 115-page sci-fi epic, whatever it might be. Would you say it's a good strategy to focus solely on writing out your story in the first draft and everything else, syntax, etc., for later drafts? Like I was saying, you want to be making all of your decisions, story decisions, character decisions, structural decisions, proving concept, making sure that you have this feeling of a recurring moment that's a reference to Hook happening in your second act, like Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey. You're always going to see him in some way physically unable to tell a lie. That's a really easy hook, but the scenes are going to be playing out revolving around that big hook. It's like the DNA of the story. You want to have all those decisions made in terms of, here are my scenes. Maybe you don't know every line of dialogue yet, but you know the big ones, you know the big moments of dialogue, because you know the primary scenes that are occurring, and then you know generally, structurally speaking, here's where they're going to be happening and why. Once you have all that laid out, and you have a general sense of, I think this scene is going to be this long in terms of page count, then you can get into the pages. And now you're just writing to the outline. You've done all the work. And now the fun part happens where you're coming up with scene direction and the visuals and the tone, and you're constructing the actual scene on the page with the dialogue, and you're focusing much more on, the whole reason we're writers. Hopefully that helps, but it wasn't a direct answer to your question, do syntax, page count, formatting for later drafts. No, I mean, I think my immediate answer is no. Don't save all that stuff for later drafts. When you're in the pages, boom, write it like this is it. I'm not going to be alive tomorrow. I'm going to write my script today. It's that feeling. You really want to take it seriously, because otherwise, what are we doing? Like what? We don't want to be lazy with our writing. You can be lazy in the brainstorming and the list making and the outlining, and you're like, I hate that word, but whatever. Once you get into the pages, this is like game day. You've been practicing all week. You've got a game on Friday. I'm performing, whether you don't want the sports analogy, I'm going to be on stage on Friday. Now I'm delivering. And you want to take it that seriously. Let's see. There was this Twitter conversation. There have been a lot of Twitter conversations that have not made me very happy. Lately, anyway, within this world that we're talking about, Kelly. Twitter conversation about the use of same, moments later, continuous. Yes, thank you for that reminder. But I'm probably going to go longer than an hour here. So, good, Julio. I just saw Julio's comment in this comment section here. Let me take a sip. Okay, moments later, continuous. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if I have an easy, quick visual. I didn't get my visuals ready in time. It's just like me, in terms of screen shares. But I'll start with continuous, because I see this misused a lot. The most basic reason for using a continuous in a scene heading, for everybody anybody who doesn't know what that means, it would be like interior Max's house, dining room continuous. So you're using continuous instead of day or night. The most basic reason to use it is because there will be literally no cut in the film. I'm showing how old we might be in the video. So what you're watching is literally no cut. We're watching a character move from the kitchen into the dining room. Camera stays on that person. Or they're in a hallway and they move into their boss's office. It's a continuous shot. There's no edit. That's really the only reason to use continuous. Because if you think about how a screenplay is constructed, the whole thing's continuous. It's a linear telling of the story, technically speaking, even though you may be jumping back in time or ahead in time from the story itself. How you're reading it, of course, everything's continuous. We're going from one scene to another. So you could argue you just say continuous at a time, but not really. It's much more of a technical use of the term. Technical meaning the crew, the editor, or at least your choice creatively. This character walks from the hallway into the boss's office. We need to stay on that person. That's the basic idea of continuous. In terms of later, moments later, so same I rarely use. Sometimes it's important because you have, but it's used for either comedic reasons or important story reasons. Like Family Guy has they're very famous for the cut tos, right? Remember that time I did this one thing and then we cut to Peter doing something ridiculous, and then we cut back to it. That isn't same, but it's a use of the visual to jump to something to inform the joke. Same, you can do that a little bit too. One character is, saying something like, I had the greatest date with this girl last night, and she was just amazing, and we're definitely seeing her again. And then you have cut to, and you could say same time or something in the scene heading. And she's like, he was the most boring person I've ever met, and I pray to God he doesn't call me again. There's a purpose for the construct of the actual scene. Just because you have a new scene heading doesn't mean that's actually a new scene. The construct of the scene is starting with me saying I had a great time, I definitely want to see that girl again, and then we go, cut to the next moment. It's technically the same happening at the same time, and she's saying, I hope you never call. That's one scene, even though we're cutting to a different location. We have two different scene headings. So sure, use it, Kelly, but there's a purpose, a story purpose. I don't know if that's such a great way of saying it. Of course, everything has a story purpose, but it's used rarely. So when you do want to use it, there's a very specific purpose for it, I guess would be the best way of saying it. Moments later is fine. I think, again, if you're dealing with this level of staying within the construct of a scene, because if you just say day, then you have to say in the action line, moments later, they do this. So I get it in terms of the purpose of using moments later, because it helps with the read, the person actually consuming the screenplay. But again, it's kind of like saying that there's a reason for the moments later. It's connected to the prior moment. So if we see moments later and it doesn't really have that much to do with the previous scene, then it's like, well, you might as well just say day. I don't really care if it's moments later, Gosh, I hope that makes sense. Let's see, Genevieve, what if we have consecutive scenes within the house, but in different rooms? Do we need to keep putting day for each scene? Really good question. So this is, gosh, I wish I would have had my screen share visuals better prepared. Really good question, because this is a little bit of a way for the writer to cheat and not have to be so cumbersome with, scene heading and then scene heading and then scene heading. Let me see if I can paint the picture without having to share my screen. Let's say you start out, top of the page, it says interior, Genevieve's dining room. And you have these things that are occurring, obviously the scene plays out. And she's walking, down the hallway. Let's say she moves toward the hall and continues down the hallway. This is whether or not you want it to be a continuous shot. Most of the time it's not, meaning there'll be an edit where we then see her from a different angle walking down the hallway. That's technically not a continuous shot. So you don't have to say continuous, but we are continuing the scene within the same overall location, right? Genevieve's house. So it'll be Genevieve's house, dining room. Genevieve walks toward, you can put a little hyphen at the end of that scene direction for action line. And then just in Final Draft, select scene heading, but just capitalize hallway. Put a hyphen after the hallway. And then describe it. It's like you're, like I said, it's a little bit of a cheat. We know she's interior, we know she's in her house. Now we know, oh, she's in the hallway. And then you continue with the rest of that moment. Maybe something happens in the hallway. And then you can get to, she steps in front of her husband's office door and then knocks. And then you could, or maybe she doesn't even knock. Maybe she just opens the door and walks in, hyphen, or into, hyphen, husband's office or Jack's office, whatever, and then she goes in there. So in a way, this is a continuous, but it's not a literal, physical continuous. There are edits. Martin Scorsese was very famous for his walk through like the kitchen, it was like this 11-minute no cut type of thing. That would be constant continuous. It would be really interesting to see how he actually wrote that. I've not read the script. But nonetheless, it's a cheat. You start with Genevieve's house, dining room, night. And then she walks toward hyphen, hallway. You're capitalizing hallway with a hyphen, and you go through that scene, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can do that as long as you want because the reader knows we're there. But now you're just kind of have a little bit of a reference that once Genevieve walks toward the hallway, reference to the production crew reading it, once she walks through the hallway, oh, we know we're in the same overall location of the house. We have to do a whole new lighting setup, sound setup. Okay, Genevieve's going to be walking this way, and she's in the hallway. Or she's going to end up in front of Jack's office door. And then we're gonna have to cut to a different way of seeing Genevieve walk into Jack's office door. But then you would just say Jack's office as basic scene heading. But we're not saying INT, we're not saying day or morning or night or evening or whatever, it's just bam. I hope that answered the question, Genevieve. Let's see, how do you write music cues? Sung lyrics. How much should you break up the lyrics with action? Whew. It's a really big question because to be completely humble and honest, I don't really know. I mean, I guess I do, but it's so different because, are you writing a musical? And then if you are, yes, then all of those lyrics are incredibly important, right? I mean, that's part of the story. So those lyrics then, maybe they're italicized in the dialogue. They're still written as dialogue. And you're going to break it up in terms of action because that person's going to be, swinging around lampposts and singing or whatever. Or if then the person is singing a song that doesn't have to do with the story, then you can say, as Jake is walking down the sidewalk, he, sings softly to himself, Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Then you don't have to worry about the lyrics, So it really depends on the purpose of these song lyrics. Music cues are tricky because more often than not, if you say, I'm going to use Led Zeppelin, especially Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, you're not going to be able to unless you have tens of millions of dollars to spend on just that one song, and even then they may not give you the rights to it. So maybe the Led Zeppelin thing is a bad idea, example. If there's a specific song type, like you could say a song like, and then the reader's like, all right, so it's like this happy-go-lucky Smash Mouth song or something, fine. Maybe we don't use Smash Mouth in the movie, but nonetheless, it's like that song. So you can reference that a little bit. If a musical cue is made where you want this type of music playing over the scene, and it's just instrumental, I wouldn't even worry about it. That's too specific. That's something the director's going to be figuring out with the composer, with the whole sound department. Producers will come in and they'll try to choose songs that might play well with that. That isn't really the writer's choice. The writer's choice. It's the writer's responsibility to give the tone and the feeling. You can say, sweeping over a majestic city skyline, clouds, pour in, threatening rain. And if you want it to be a relatively long visual sense, then you could say an eagle swoops through, and we follow the eagle as it's we aren't worried about the actual music that's playing with the eagle as it's flying around these skyscrapers. I don't know if that answered your question, Sherry. I hope it did. But in terms of the lyrics, it all depends on how important those lyrics are. If you want every single word of those lyrics heard, choose a stanza or two. Don't sing the entire Stairway to Heaven song, obviously. But yeah. So there you go. All right. So Kelly is saying cue music, and exactly, but mood is there. Never italicization. I don't know. I would say never. I agree that probably not a good idea to use it a ton. But every now and then it helps me as a reader to be like, something's different there. I'm okay with that. As long as it isn't overused, I would be all right with it. Again, as long as it isn't overused and you use it in places that make sense, there's a connection. Otherwise, then the reader's like, we've got bold, we have capitalized, we have italics, and it's just a mess. You just want to be really careful. The general rule of thumb, keep things either lowercase or capitalized. And that's as simple as that. Okay, so yeah, and then when it's in dialogue. That's what you mean, Kelly. Yeah, don't italicize dialogue. There's no need. If it's in dialogue, that's what it is. It's dialogue. In scene directions, just quoting commandments, but there are yes. There's no need to, and there's no need to put anything in quotes in dialogue. It's just the character speaking. Scene direction, action lines. Yeah, you can italicize and capitalize sometimes, but again, don't go crazy. Carlo, are there 3-camera sitcoms still written in a different format than single camera, which is the same as features? They used to be different, making the length longer. One page equals 30 seconds. There are still 3-camera sitcoms being shot. Not as many, obviously, but you have, you know, the moms. There's that Beth Bear sitcom, something about the neighborhood. I think it's just called The Neighborhood. But that's on, you know, typical soundstage, 3-camera type of thing. They might have a slightly different setup sometimes with the cameras, but they used to be different, making the length longer. One page equaled 30 seconds. Yes and no. You don't see that nearly as much as way back when. You're looking at a sitcom page count, you know, 26, 27, maybe 28 pages. Oh, so Kelly's bringing up a good question. Maybe I'll finish with something a little more interesting. don't take offense to that, Kelly. But transitions, you know, transitions aren't incredibly exciting. But she's asking, is fade in and out needed in spec? I use dissolve only. You know, I'm of the thought process with transitions where absolutely use them. Like, it's part of the quality of the read, but only use them when you have a purpose to use them. You know, if you want a fast transition from the previous scene to the next, and a cut to is leading us to the moment, kind of like the Family Guy reference where Peter talks about, you remember that time, and we cut to, and it's bam, and we see exactly what's happening that he's talking about, but we get the visual of it, then the cut to makes sense because it's connecting the two moments. Use the cut to. Most of the time, we know we're cutting to the next scene, you know, but the transition is used as a, what's the word I'm looking for? To help create feeling when reading. So if you have a fade to, we know that it's a slower movement into the next scene. You probably had some kind of, you know, emotional thing happen in the prior scene, and then we're going to fade into the next one. Fade out or fade, I rarely see or use fade in unless it's near the top of the, or beginning of the script. You know, we're fading into this. If you're ending this really long, epic, emotional or action-based montage and it ends with something really big or emotional, like it's somebody's death, and they're like, oh my God, you know, then you can fade out and then fade in because there's a feeling to that, right? You had all this, wow, stuff happen, and now we're resetting the reader's brain with the fade out and fade in. You could probably just say fade to. But if you really think about what it looks like on the page when we finish the scene with fade out, and then we also choose, and I'm going this way and this way because on the page, you know, in a final draft or a movie magic screenwriter, it formats it for you. So it puts fade out in the bottom right of the page. And then it puts fade in at the top left of the scene. And it's not always the bottom of the page, bottom of the scene. That creates a lot of white space on the page when you've got a fade out and you've got a fade in and you've got a scene heading and then you're moving. It's a reset for the brain of the reader to move from scene into scene, which sometimes really helps because it's like we're ending that feeling and emotion. We're moving now into something completely new. I don't know what to feel yet about this scene. If you don't have any space, or at least, you know, no more than the usual amount of space between scene into scene, the reader's going to quickly move through it, which is fine, and hopefully they're quickly reading your script, but they're not resetting their emotional brain as often. So sometimes those help, right? Meaning adding a transition, fade out, fade in. Dissolve to, I think, is fine. I would use it sparingly because then it's kind of like, you know, if you're using it after every other scene or every 3 scenes or something, it kind of loses its luster. Unless you're writing some kind of like comic booky or stylized Sin City, and then it's like, yeah, cool, I'm going to dissolve into that, I'm going to crossfade into this because it's kind of ridiculous after a while, you know. But again, it's all about the feeling. How about when switching back and between 2 S? So, let's see. Sorry, Ryan. You can retype that. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Back and forth between 2 scenes, maybe is what you mean? Back and forth between 2 scenes. You could probably reference a level. It's all about how we're presenting this to the reader. Because sometimes you could very well say, we go back to the previous moment and see it again, but it's different. And sometimes you can just say that. There are no rules about what you can or can't say, unless, you know, like I was saying earlier, the technical things. I would try to stay away from that. At the same time, nobody's going to flunk you for using the technical stuff. It's just, you know, it's difficult for me to say, do that, never do that. There's really no such thing as never or always. There just isn't. You can technically do whatever you want, but you have to be following some set of rules. Otherwise, the person opening the script's going to be like, what is this? I'm so used to reading something that looks like this, and this is totally different, which in some cases might be a good thing. Usually not. So you want to try to stick to it. Let me see. So Julio, I'm not sure if you have a moment more to answer this question. I have 2 scenes going on at the same time. Can I use cut to, or what would you recommend? Please, yeah, okay. 2 scenes going on at the same time. So honestly, I think the easiest thing would be, you could cut to, you could transition cut to. You could quite literally say in the scene direction, happening at the same exact time, Julio, you know, charges after a dog in the alley. I don't know, I'm just making this up. You can just say it, happening at the same exact time, and then the reader's like, okay, you know, that we're not too worried about that, because it helps. Just simplify it. If you try to get too wordy, or if you completely ignore it, they may not completely understand. Oh, this is happening at the time. The cut to usually is probably not the exact, is not enough. Give us a little bit more. Is there where we could use, Brian, I think, there you go. Scenes happening simultaneously after establishing the locations, can just go to slug lines then. Yes, basically, again, kind of like how I answered Julio's question. You can just simplify and say it in there. Happening at the same exact time, this occurs. As long as you don't, it would be a little ridiculous if you say that in every single scene where everything's happening at the same exact time, which is kind of a brain explosion. If you think about, you know, time, space, continuum stuff, I don't think you're going there. But sure, if 2 scenes are happening, so just say, happens at the same exact time as the previous moment, and we're having this happen. As long as it's sticking to the purpose of the story overall, and you're going to be continuing, you know, the rest of it in a linear way, which most screenplays are told, then, you know, I think you're fine. Yeah, let's see here. Yeah, a lot of people are asking about intercuts. So, intercut, is that a good use? Describe it as yeah, I think you do. You know, split screens are a little tricky too. How often do you really need to use split screens? You can use them. I wouldn't try to format the page. So you could just capitalize split screen : and say at the same, while we see Meredith performing her violin on the stage, you know, Jackie is chopping down a tree in the forest. And then we're like, oh, split screen. And then you're following along, you know, every action that you can, scene direction line or action line can start split screen. Meredith, you know, walks off the stage, and Jackie does this in the split screen, you know. But the best answer is always the simplest. Don't try to overdo it, and stick to the same type of formula format that you use. Let's say on page 9, you've got a split screen reference. On page 68, don't do it differently. Just use the same type of split screen reference that you use on page 9. Once you start mixing things up and not doing it in the same way, that's when a reader's going to be like, well, you know, in their brain, they're probably going to remember. But the simplest explanation is always, I don't want to use the word always, usually the best route. If you are just going to describe something, like I was saying, Julio, just, you know, describe it, keep it really simple. Don't over describe it. The reader only needs little references, because they're going to be following story, and they're going to be relying on the visuals to show us the story. I think the best, and I didn't get into dialogue, but the best advice I can give you about dialogue: be unexpected, have the character coming always from that character's, there's the word always, but in this case it's true, always from that character's personal intent. What do they want? Throughout the whole script, in terms of the concept, throughout the whole act, throughout the whole scene. What do they want? Who's going to win the scene? If there's an argument, if somebody's trying to one-up the other, what's that back and forth look like? And that's where, sometimes being unexpected can help. And then, I had one more. In terms of dialogue, there was a technical reference there. But, dialogue enhances the visuals. If we see something that occurs, and then the character just talks about what we just saw, well, we're kind of doubling up. Unless the character has extreme, unbelievable fun voice, like Juno or something from Juno. I was trying to think of the name of the movie. But Juno from Juno. So yeah, if the character has a voice like Juno, then voiceover sometimes can work really well because there's commentary in what we're seeing. In a general rule of thumb, dialogue is enhancing the visuals. I mean, visuals are helping with the dialogue. Allow the scene to work together as opposed to rely on only one aspect of it to give us everything. I see that a lot in dialogue in really early drafts, where the writer is relying on all of this exposition to tell us things. And I don't need that. I mean, most of the time, I could suggest to a writer, could you have this scene without any dialogue, and we'd still get the same message? We'd still understand the same thing. The story still continues. Most of the time, you could probably write the scene without any dialogue. You don't necessarily want to or have to, because of course, dialogue's great. We all want great dialogue. But it's good rule of thumb. Visuals are enhanced by the dialogue. How many long monologues can you have in a script without getting tossed? There's no magic number. There just isn't. It's such a lazy answer, and I apologize, but it really does all depend. Sometimes long monologues are amazing. I love reading these. After a while, though, if I'm seeing scene after scene after scene after scene where the characters just don't stop talking, and there isn't something incredibly engaging, and even then, I'm still like, why are they still talking? Why are they saying all this stuff? After a while, the reader's going to just pull out, and they're just not. And they're like, I'm done, pulling the parachute cable. But yeah, I mean, there's no magic number. It's not like, oh, you've got 5 of them. It all depends. Like sometimes, if you're writing a musical, it looks like a monologue because the person's singing the song. Arguably, a song is a monologue. But I mean, not in the technical standpoint, obviously. But yeah, I think that's the hard part about talking about page writing and format. There's no hard and fast true rule, but at the same time, there are still some rules you got to follow. If you are A-list screenwriter, you've got a couple movies, 3 or 4 TV shows that have been produced, you're known around town, you have much more leeway. You can do much more with the script page because you're already trusted with the words. When readers are reading your stuff, they're like, oh, it's this person's script. Okay, I'm in good hands. What's he or she going to do? If it's a brand new rookie writer and nobody knows who you are, and you try to do some pretty crazy things, they're going to be like, well, unless it's A Quiet Place and you're writing the format of the script in a completely different way, but because it serves the story, most readers are going to be like, this isn't working. I don't get it. What are you trying to do? Because they don't trust you yet. Doesn't mean they don't like you or your writing. It's just, it's not really, you're just not there yet, which is fine. So, and that's where it comes from a difficult place. There's been a lot of commentary on Twitter where certain people have said you should be doing this, and then other people are saying, no, that's terrible advice. It's easy for one person to give advice, myself included, and it's not so easy to take that advice. So everybody listening, all of what you heard from me today, you don't have to take any of this. You really don't. You can write the script however you want, but generally speaking, from my own experience, 16 plus years of reading scripts, how many I've read, from A-listers down to rookie, never written a screenplay before, there are basic rules. There were, generally speaking, things you should probably do more often than not. I think the best advice for page formatting is don't overdo it. Don't use a particular technique over and over and over and over again. because it is, you have to consider the reader's experience. If you were reading your screenplay and you didn't know anything about the story, how easy is it to see all this? Oh, there's one thing I didn't talk about. I want to talk about grammar a little bit. I'm not going to go into, can I give a summary of rules, Andrew? You know, I'm going to, I mean, please don't take offense to this, but no. Because, well, for one, this is being recorded. You can go back and watch all this. But my reason for saying no is because I don't want everybody to think that you have to absolutely do all of these things. I think that the only hard and fast things I was really talking about is like the usage of continuous, or, you know, why to capitalize certain words, you know, because it's a sound, and yet sound's important. You know, that's a yes or a no kind of rule, and that's really the definition of the rule. It's a do or don't, yes or no. And most of the things I'm talking about are kind of wiggly, you know, like, yeah, you can, most of the time you're doing that, but there's never really always and always, and there's very rarely a never. It's just make sure that your choices are matching from page to page. If you do a scene heading in one particular type of format, you can do periods after the words. Most people are used to hyphens, but there's always a period after INT or EXT. That's always. Very rarely there's an always. And then the rest of it, like, do a period, fine, but as long as you're doing it, or if you want to underline the scene headings, fine, just always do that. It's up to you, the writer, because of how you want the reader to feel. What, you know, really think about it. What does it do to the eyes, to a reader, if my scene heading is underlined? What does the page look like without even referencing the actual reading of the words? And just take a step back and go, oh, oh, that's the other thing I didn't cover, really. All right, 2 things before we go. I'll try to get this in under 10 minutes. Grammar. Your script does not need to be grammatically perfect. In other words, if you want sentence fragments, if you want to have all these ellipses in, in the scene direction, it doesn't have to be a perfect sentence. Sometimes if it's a run-on sentence, whatever. Most of the time, I like to see sentence fragments more often than not. Like, it's, you know, a really short little reference to words, you know, like you don't have to be grammatically perfect. The reason I bring that up is because I do see a lot of writers who are writing their first or second screenplay. They think it needs to be kind of reading like a book a little bit, you know. You don't have to write it that way. It's fine, and it's good if it's grammatically correct. That's fine. You know, nobody's going to be like, oh, this guy's grammar's too good. It's more about the feeling of the read. I like using ellipses sometimes. Again, you know, Kelly, don't overuse them. But, you know, like what an ellipses, set of ellipses do for me is it gives me like a little trailing off of the line of action or line of dialogue. It's kind of like you're easing into the next set. A hyphen's kind of like this hard stop. Ooh, hyphen, I'm moving into the next one. You think about the feeling that these little marks on the page make, and then use them for specific reasons. The other thing I want to talk about, there's a little thing called Mosaic Writing, and it sounds much prettier than and good than it actually is. If you look down the left side of your page and see how you begin your scene direction or action lines, just look at the words. He, she, you know, Angela, Stephen, Michael, Stephen, Angela, he, she, they. Just look down the left side of the page and see how often you're using pronouns to start the lines. A lot of times in early drafts, I noticed that almost every single line of action begins with either a character's name or he or she. Nothing wrong with doing that. But if you're doing it over and over and over again, all the time, you're always starting an action line with the character name or he or she or they, it's boring. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. Like, the reader is just going to be like, oh my God, it's like a pattern of all these names down the side of they haven't even read the script. I could just open a screenplay and just scroll down and be like, yep, look at that. And I just kind of know that the writer hasn't really looked at the page, taken a step back without reading the words and just, what does the page look like? Because there's an experience a reader has when they're sitting down to read something, whether it's in a book or in a screenplay, which are two very different experiences, obviously. They want to enjoy the read. They want to feel like this is flowing. And if you start every scene, a line of action or scene direction with somebody's name, it's like you're kind of starting over every time. Stephen does that. Stephen moves into this. Stephen opens the refrigerator. Stephen walks to his car. I'm like, well, okay, but what are we really seeing? Yes, we're seeing Stephen walking to the car, but how is he walking? How do you want me to feel about him walking there? Maybe he trips a little bit, or are his pants too tight? Is it really hot? So he kind of, he's walking slowly. Give me a feeling through that visual, as opposed to just Stephen walks to his car. All right, so here's an example. Steve walks into the bedroom, looks at the window, it's filthy. Steve grabs a blanket off of his bed, throws it at the window, that won't help. Steve pauses, thinks, releases a deep sigh. Steve slowly walks over, picks up the blanket, folds it, puts it back on the bed. Generally speaking, this is fine. I'm seeing the little makeup of the moment. He's in his bedroom, and he's probably got a mood here a little bit, but it is kind of boring to read it that way. So if you break it up, it's the same exact moment, same exact actions, but it's just reading a little more interesting. Look how much easier it is to kind of view this with your eyes, walking into his bedroom. Steve's eyes make their way to the window. It's filthy. Snatching a blanket from the end of his bed, he winds up and throws it at the window. That won't help. He pauses, thinks. A deep sigh, fine. With slouching shoulders, Steve walks over and picks up the blanket, folding it carefully, places it in the bed. There's just a little bit more of an emotional flow to the same exact moment. And you also have little bits of cuts here. Like, even though there was some discussion earlier, walking into his bedroom, Steve's eyes make their way over the window. Technically, it's filthy. You could have 3 separate cuts here, right? Edits. If the director wanted, she could have a different angle on him walking into the room, and then a little bit of an angle or cut to Steve's eyes, and then you also have a little cut to the window. It's filthy. Those are 3 different edits in one scene direction, line of action. So going back to what I was saying, yes, technically a new line of action is like an edit, but it doesn't mean every single line is one edit. It's ridiculous. Your script would be 300 pages, So general rule of thumb, sure, that line of action is like one edit moving into another edit, but you can also have multiple edits here. Walk into the bedroom, his eyes, the window, how it's filthy. So anyway, you get a sense here compared to this, right? Steve walks this. Steve grabs a blanket. Steve pauses. Steve slowly walks over. So it's just a way to look at your script, and it's fine to start. Steve slowly walks over and picks up the blanket. It's like, taken out of context, it's a perfectly fine line of action. But if you do it over and over and over again, you're like, all told, it's just, we can change that up a little bit. We have the same exact thing happen. That is a good example of editing and not rewriting. A rewrite would be, he's in a different room, he's in a different mood, it doesn't happen at all, and nope, I'm just cutting it, or whatever. That's rewriting. It's a completely different character and structural type of approach. This is just editing, moving the words around, but it helps. And sometimes it's kind of a fun pass. It's an easy writing session, because you're not really writing. If you look at your script, you sit down and go, wow, what kind of editing can I do? I'm not making huge decisions. The story's still going to stay the same, but I'm just going to pretty up my script a little bit. Every now and then Steve walks in, Steve does that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just try to break it up. All right. Let me just make sure we've got it right. Shaden is asking, this is a good way to end this. Good question. Can a good story or idea be overlooked due to poor formatting? Generally speaking, yes. Now, that's an extremely relative question, because if the story is so special and unique and we've never seen it before, A Quiet Place, their formatting was completely ridiculous. I don't know if you've read the script, but it was like 47 pages. And they had full pages of just like one word. There's no format. But the story itself was like, okay, the combination of the formatting with the story, now that makes sense. If you just don't know how to format a script and you're still just trying to, write a screenplay, yeah, that might trip some people up. Mainly because they won't read the whole script, right? They're not really going to dive in because they're so used to reading a screenplay in a certain way. It is going to make them pause. And let's say you do have a really strong script, and some of the little pieces of formatting is off, or the words on the page, you know, big blocks of action, and you probably don't need it, you can break that up. Typos, huge. Typos pull a reader out. If there's anything that pulls a reader out of the read, it's going to hinder the ability of that story being considered. So it's the easiest thing to change because it's editing. And so it's easy to overlook it, right? But because it's easy, God, take the time because it really can make the difference. And you can infuse voice in there and tone and feeling. And so we're all wordsmiths, we're all writers, we're all people who are trying to deliver a visual medium through words, and that's really hard. So just take the time, read as many screenplays as you can, see how other people are doing it. If you like some things other people are doing, cool, use that. If you don't like what other people are doing, but everybody says it's great, you don't like it, then don't do it. You know, like I said, no hard and fast rules other than, well, it depends on where you are in your career. And, you know, if you are an A-list writer, you can kind of get away with a lot more than you can if you're looking. So, all right, everybody, this will be available on the Pro Tips and Tricks page, probably a couple weeks. You should check out the Pro Tips and Tricks page. ISA has a YouTube page. Absolutely utilize the YouTube page. I think we have like 720 videos or something on there. Not all of them are this long. Some of them are really small bites. So you should utilize all this. You know, I love that you're all trying to educate yourself. You're all trying to improve. That's really all we can do. Is just try to be a little bit better than we were the day before, and just one step at a time. Let's get a little bit better. All right. Well, thanks, Shaden. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We've got pretty wild set of months coming ahead of us. So let's just be patient and nice, and you know, God forbid, love other people. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Lots more to come from the ISA, so stay tuned. But I will see you all soon.